Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and we have this message today on the story of Abraham, part 21. And we're picking up where we left off from 20, where basically the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, the angels come to see how they're going to be, and they decide that they're going to destroy the cities. So they tell Lot and his family to go, and they take them and move them out of the city for their sakes and for Abraham's sake, seeing as it's Abraham's nephew. And, they tell him to flee to the mountain. And Lot says, "Well, not so, my lord, lest some evil overtake me." Probably thinking stuff like the wildlife and all these things that could come against them, like mountain lions and other creatures like that are out there more than likely in these areas. And because there is a lot of wildlife like that in the land of Canaan and what ends up becoming Israel. There's mountain lions in certain parts, like in Judah. There's as mountain lions and stuff that way, and just different parts. And then there's also a different, like the actual lions too, which dwelled in the dens and stuff. And they actually had the see, it's not like the Saharan lion with the full mane, and this is just an interesting fact to throw in here, but they had the Asiatic lions, which are almost nearly extinct, only found in some areas of Indonesia right now, just a little like area where they're preserving their life and stuff like that, keeping them there endangered. But they have kind of like a different type of beard where you can see their ears and whatnot, different than the Saharan lion. But they have those there. They have stuff like jackals in some areas, like near Egypt, for example. They have jackals in the wilderness. And they're probably worried about the bandits and stuff like that, as we covered in the last, that there's people like that, especially probably highly likely to find them outside of the highly corrupt cities of Sodom and Gomorrah before they were destroyed. So we see that. And Lot's just saying, well, I don't want to go to this mountain out in the middle of nowhere here. I want to go to a city. So he proposes that he goes to a city, which the city is Zor, that he goes to stay in and to flee from the cities in. And then the angels say, well, that's okay. You can do that. You can go to these cities and or to this city and stay there, and we won't destroy and overthrow the city. Because, it's talking about like the main areas is Sodom and Gomorrah, but there's areas around it too, smaller cities that are influenced and all these things by, just all these things that happen, that basically they don't overthrow Zor, so Lot can go there, and Lot and his family. So continuing on, Genesis chapter 19, verse 22. Haste thee, escape hither, for I cannot do anything till thou be come hither. Therefore the number of the city was called Zor. So we see the name of the city that they fled on to, and it was allowed that they would, and they preserved the city and kept it intact and didn't overthrow it with how they're going to overthrow it, which we'll get into here shortly. So Genesis chapter 19, verse 23. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zor. So that basically means early in the morning, like very early. The sun's just now rising, and they departed out of the city, and it's morning, and they've entered into Zor. So Genesis chapter 19, verse 24. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. So this fire and brimstone that came from the heavens, that came from God. It's a very devastating destruction that has come from the heavens and from God, that it's so brutal, so to speak, that it completely destroyed and devastated the cities, and anything that would grow there or inhabit there, the land just became uninhabitable. That they can't grow things there, they can't, that land to this day is uninhabitable. It's no longer valid land or good for anything. The soil's not good for anything. And it's just, infertile, barren land that they don't inhabit and do anything there. So that's just something that's noteworthy. And, just how thoroughly they were destroyed. And even to this day, that it's still that way. So, Genesis chapter 19, verse 25, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. So all of the cities were, Sodom and Gomorrah and the area around about it and the plains and all that, and everything that grew upon the ground, as we just talked about, was overthrown and destroyed. Nothing good was spared there. And it's worth noting too, we've talked about before, when Lot chose this land out, when they had that big fight and dispute, Abraham's servants and the servants of Lot with their cattle, and instead of Abraham getting mad and bent out of shape, he used diplomacy and just said, well, here, so we don't fight and strive with each other, we're brethren, you take whichever land you want to choose, either right here in Canaan, or would you rather have the very lustrous, very fertile, very, good land for everything you would want to do as a herdman and as one to grow crops and all this stuff over there by Sodom and Gomorrah. When he saw that land, he saw how it was, that it was compared, again we say it was compared to the Garden of Eden and the Garden of the Lord, just for how good of land that it was before it was destroyed. That it was such a good, fruitful land that, it was good for the cattle, and it was good for anything that they would desire to grow upon that land. So Lot chose it, and now it's just so bad and barren, and the soil's no good for anything because God utterly destroyed it. And the land suffered and was destroyed because of what happened there. So Genesis chapter 19, verse 26, but his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. So they were told, basically, don't look back at the city and don't, anything like that, like don't have any attachment to that city or anything like that. And Lot's wife looked back, and then she became the pillar of salt. Basically that, they just weren't to even look towards that they were supposed to just keep on moving and go on to Zor. But in disobedience, she looked back, and then she turned into a pillar of salt. And that's just what happens right here in this text, and what takes place there. And we're going to continue on. Genesis chapter 19, verse 27. And Abraham got up early in the morning in the place where he stood before the Lord. So Abraham rose up early, about the time that God's destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, early in the morning. because that's when they finally got Lot out and he was safely over in Zor, because they came late at night, the angels did, to see the city, and it was determined that the cities would be utterly destroyed. And by the time they got Lot there, it was early in the morning. So Abraham saw, and he rose early in the morning, as he probably often did, tending to cattle and all the needs of his people there, and his tent, being the overseer over it. And, he had his steward and everything that was looking over it, but he was also Abraham was the head of all of everything that went on there. So he probably still went over everything, even though he delegated most of it to the steward. So that's just some things to take into consideration and to add to the sermon here. But, where he stood before the Lord. So in Genesis chapter 19, verse 28, and he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. So the cities, Sodom, which he's nearest onto, not Gomorrah, but he's seeing Sodom and the complete destruction and the smoke and the fire just come upon it. And he's probably in bewilderment just seeing it, and he believed full well that the Lord can do it. And, he was deeply concerned about the city. If we just kind of backtrack a little bit for a second, he was really concerned with the city, and, like thinking, well, what if there's good people there? And what if, all this, will you destroy the people for this many sake? And, God basically knows how it is, because the cry of it that came up onto him, as we talked about before. But he just, he was telling Abraham, yeah, if I, because he talked him down to 10 people. If I find 10 people there that are good people, that aren't, very vile in every way they could possibly be, then I won't destroy the city. And I'm paraphrasing it, putting into words, but basically God's saying that he wouldn't destroy the city if that came, like if they found that he wouldn't even do it then. But pretty much the truth is, all the good people of Sodom and Gomorrah were pretty much weeded out by, probably kind of a brute mentality type way of being, where, basically the strongest people just took what they want. And, like and good people, they were just way outnumbered by the bad people. And then the good people ended up pretty much getting killed by the bad people. So there wasn't any good people left. And that's just how bad the cities got. And, how, and it must have been a lot of anguish, because God's hearing the cries come from the souls of all those righteous that died from the cities. God already knows. He, just as the blood of righteous Abel was slayed, he's also seeing and hearing the souls of the lost ones that were the good ones, and also probably bad ones too, just everybody killing everybody, robbing everybody. And, it got to that point. So God utterly destroyed it, but he gave Abraham the benefit of the doubt, just because he so highly favored Abraham. God loves everybody equally, right? But he highly favored Abraham because Abraham did everything that God showed him to do. Everything God wanted him to do, Abraham forsook all, made big sacrifices, and he did it. So he highly favored Abraham enough to give him the benefit of the doubt, and to listen to his interceding and, well, bartering and just haggling for the non-total devastation and destruction of these cities, probably admiring his compassion and his, just good, kind-hearted nature that Abraham had. And these are all just things to take into consideration, like the way people are thinking here, the way people are feeling, what God's seeing, we see from the text. And it's just something to take deeply into consideration from all these ways around. And, it's good to kind of look into why people do certain things that they do, and again, like Lot, like, well, why is he so afraid to go into the mountains? And then we look at reasons why, just based upon everything that there is to be afraid about. Like there are a lot of reasons, which God probably would have protected them. And just as those angels were there, they probably would have been watched over and protected all the same in that mountain. But again, God had compassion, and it was allowed that they went to Zor, and Zor was spared. So it's good to just look at things from all angles. And, just because you read a book, you read Genesis one time, it's good to just keep going back to books and reading them, because God will keep revealing more and more things to you, the Word being alive. And we got to continue with where we're at here. So Genesis 19:29, our last verse here. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities which Lot dwelt. So yeah, basically, Lot just kind of went along and everything, but God just had that compassion upon, he remembered Abraham, and he sent his nephew Lot out from there, just because he remembered Abraham and had compassion on Lot, who was originally with Abraham. And God knew that Abraham deeply loved Lot, because, he went against how many ever kings it was and how many ever men outnumbered, just to kind of glance back at the past again for a little bit of what already took place. But God knew that Abraham loves Lot, because he wasn't going to let Lot and his family be victims and captives of some marauders that came against the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. That he readied up his armed forces of, it says, trained servants, not necessarily men of war, but trained servants, 318, I believe. And not only that, but he also had his allies, the Amorites, and I think the three brethren, and all of their men that went with them too. But they were still outnumbered, and they went and rescued them despite these facts, and God was with them, and God knew the love that he had for his nephew. So that's just all noteworthy things to look at here. And that's the message for today, and you all have a blessed day.